Good morning. Welcome back to Mountain Connect. How's everybody doing today? Well, I hope you're all wide awake because we have a very special keynote planned for you today. And without further ado, it is my honor to introduce the moderator. She is the Vice President of Broadband Policy and Funding Strategy for Nokia and is considered one of the leading experts in all things BEAD. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the one and only Lori Adams.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. How are you today? So folks over by the over there, feel free to move over this way. Jeff, first I want to say congratulations on 10 years of an amazing Mountain Connect conference. You've come a long way from the days of middle of the night fire drills at the hotels up in Vail. But this morning we are going to have a very robust conversation around BEAD, and I am pleased to present Evan Feinman with NTIA, who of course is the dad of all of the state programs. And Brandon Carson is joining us as well, who's the broadband director for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So before we get started here, I just want to say one thing, is that one topic we won't be talking about today is what happens to BEAD with the election. It's a sexy topic, but we could probably spend an hour going down that rabbit hole. So in lieu of that, I want to start by just asking the audience, how many folks here are interested or will be absolutely going after the BEAD dollars in their state? How many folks are thinking about going after BEAD dollars in your state? Excellent. And how many are just saying, nope, this is not a program I'm interested in? All right, a few hands. All right, maybe we'll convince you by the end of the session.
Let's go.
Absolutely. So Evan, why don't we start with you, because as of yesterday, there are now 33 states and territories that have gotten their Volume 2 approved, and where are we with the state of BEAD currently?
BEAD is on track. We are moving along incredibly expeditiously. The thing that we are also focused on, though, is getting it right? So going fast and getting each of these initial proposals into the best version of themselves that they can be are values that are in tension, but it's a healthy tension, right? I mean, we are keenly aware of the ills that accrue to communities that lack universal access to affordable, reliable, high-speed internet connectivity, right? I mean, we know that kids have lower GPAs, that elderly folks have to go into long-term care sooner. We know that access to services like telehealth and just broad participation in the national and global economy is not really available to you if you can't access the internet at the same time, right? So that spurs us toward urgency, right? At the same time, Congress has been pretty clear that there is not another $42 billion in the offing, right? Like, that isn't happening. So we got to get it right. It's incumbent upon us and the states who are our partners. I'm going to say states. I apologize to anybody from the territories here. States and territories is just a little less, rolls off the tongue a little less well. But I always mean states and territories, and the territories remain in my heart. But look, we are building all these things as quickly as we can. I also want to say that because this is a one-time opportunity, it's also really critically important that the folks that are in the room who are on the fence or who raised your hands and said, you're not necessarily going to be participating in BEAD right now, recognize that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. You do not want to let this thing pass you by. And I know people have concerns about dealing with the federal government, but listen, we are doing all that we can to make this an approachable, easy to work with program. And just an example of that, which I suspect we'll talk about a little more in the future, we are building a class of the field permitting and permitting support operation that's going to be tremendously impactful and is going to smooth the way for all of our subgrantees once we have thousands and thousands of projects across the country. So all of that as a preamble is to say, you should expect, as you have already seen, that NTIA will continue to announce approvals of Volume 2s of initial proposals, and then you'll also see announcements, as you've already seen, of approval of challenge process results, and you will soon begin to see announcements of the commencement of subgrantee selection processes, right? People are going to be invited to apply for project areas and put in bids, and then we will start rolling through rounds 1, round 2, one hopes not more than round 3 in various states as we approach universal coverage, but that is all, we are very much in flight right now, and that's going to continue to be the case, and we see a clear path forward to a successful program.
Great, thanks. And Brandon, I know as one of the first kind of batch of states that got their Volume 2 approval, can you just kind of walk us through the status of things in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, Lori, I sure can. Firstly, thanks for having me. It's good to be here at Mountain Connect. Great event this week. I really enjoyed it. To Evan's opening point, things are on track. We're in a good place in Pennsylvania. Our Volume 2 was approved back in May. I think we were one of the first 7 or 8 states out of the gate. Not sure we were aiming to be one of the first 7 or 8 states out of the gate, but that's where we ended up.
Did such a good job, it just came together.
So we have, since May, since the approval of Volume 2, we have moved forward with our challenge process. We launched in April, late April. We ran a 30-day window for submitting challenges, and then a 30-day window for rebuttals, and 30 days for adjudication. And the process overall went very well for us. We were really, really happy and thrilled with how things turned out. We had staffed up and made sure we had the capacity we needed to run a successful process. Right now, we've completed adjudication late last month. Now we are truing up our map with the latest version of the fabric. So that work is being done this week and likely the first part of next week. And then we'll be submitting the final data to NTIA for review and ultimately approval so we can get started with subgrantee selection. In terms of kind of shifting to subgrantee selection, we are synthesizing our Volume 2 and developing our program guidelines. That work is nearing completion. We have probably a 95% draft, working closely with NTIA and our federal program officer on that process to make sure that all the interpretations that we've had of what's outlined in Volume 2 is finding its way into our program guidelines, so we're consistent and on track with where we need to be. We've established what we've coined broadband serviceable areas. These will be the polygons that will be used. They are groupings of eligible BSLs that will be available for the BEAD program. So we're working to finalize those broadband serviceable areas now, obviously pending approval from NTIA on our final listing of locations. Something I wanted to mention, we've been, about a year and a half ago, we established 4 subcommittees that have really helped to inform our planning processes. And I don't know that I can overstate how important those 4 subcommittees have been to all of our work. We engaged a pretty diverse group of stakeholders as we developed our Volume 1s, our Volume 2s, and even before that as we completed our 5-year action plan. We have a data and mapping group, a technical group, workforce and supply chain, and then an outreach and education subcommittee. And each of those groups have 8 members, various backgrounds, various sectors that are represented on those subcommittees, but they inform our board and have done so every step of the way for about a year and a half now. So shout out to those folks and the work that they've put in. We recently launched a Broadband Ready Communities program, helping to get our local governments ready for these investments. Looking at right-of-way issues, permitting, starting to think about ways to streamline those processes and consider standardizing some things across the Commonwealth. So we've developed a checklist. Applications are open now. Communities that want to be branded broadband ready, signaling that an ISP should absolutely come and look at an opportunity in that community. So we're working through that program now. Excited about that. We're getting a lot of traction with that from our communities. We just, as of a couple weeks ago, onboarded a consultant. We're a team of about a dozen in Pennsylvania. I was the second in the door about 2.5 years ago. I think it was the day before or day after the NOFO dropped, interestingly enough. So I had a little light reading in the early days there.
Keep it by your bedside.
Yep, indeed. But with the, even with the fact that we've grown over the last 2 years, we still need to add capacity as we gear up for BEAD. So we are onboarding a consultant, adding that additional capacity, and I think even more importantly, some of the technical expertise that our team lacks in-house. So we're excited about that. And lastly, I wanted to mention, as we open things up here, we've learned a lot from the other states. We've begged, borrowed, and stolen some items from various states. So for those states that are in the room, thank you. You've helped Pennsylvania a lot as we've endeavored to get through our various volumes and now launch our subgrantee selection. I think that collaboration obviously is going to continue as we move forward. The State Broadband Leaders Network has been great for myself and our team, and again, really excited about the next steps here on the BEAD front.
Excellent, thanks. So for those of you who aren't familiar with, or who weren't familiar with the BEAD processes and timeline when you came to the conference, you should be by now. But we're going to sort of structure our conversation this morning around what those BEAD processes are. So we're going to start in a little bit about the challenge process. We're going to talk about the Volume 2 requirements. We're going to talk about the subgrantee selection and then implementation. And so if there's any questions that we miss up here, please feel free to ask them. We're going to save some time at the end for audience questions. So Brandon, let's start with you on this. I mean, I have kind of a three-parter, but I'll ask them one at a time. I'm not going to force you to remember them all. So the first one is, as far as the challenge process goes, I mean, we've heard some really interesting anecdotes from the states. I was in Indiana about a month ago, and they were talking about how they received somewhere around 780,000 challenges, which is a massive amount of challenges. Can you just talk through a little bit, what are you seeing in terms of challenges, who is submitting those challenges, and just a little bit about that to start with?
Yeah, the 700,000+ number was not lost on us. As we geared up, we were concerned that we may get flooded with challenges, and even if you have dedicated the staff to review, 700,000 is a big number. You're sifting through a lot of data. You're trying to ensure that you're making the best decision possible on some of those individual locations. For us, in the end, we saw just over 90,000 locations challenged. So it was a manageable number. We had a team of 3 that were dedicated to working through the challenge data. There was a pretty good mix, but by and large, we saw a lot of planned provision of service challenges. There's a lot of activity right now, not only in Pennsylvania, but across the country. Folks are trying to get out in front of BEAD. It's great. You're helping us get there. So we saw a significant number of planned provision of services challenges come in, and then some enforceable commitment challenges. Between those two categories, really rounded out the lion's share of the 90,000+ locations that we saw.
So how is this changing your map? Because we're hearing from, states are all around that. When they started this process, they started with a threshold number of, whatever the locations were for, that they deemed initially eligible for BEAD, and then that has been reduced as the challenge processes are processed, and then as you deconflict other, locations that are part of other government funding programs.
It definitely is going to change our map. Obviously, pending NTIA approval, don't want to state that again because we want to make sure we're in a good place on that front. But just to run through the numbers, I had our data folks give me the latest numbers before I flew out to Denver. We started back when the allocations were made. So our allocation is right around $1.2 billion in Pennsylvania. So when the allocation was made, we were at roughly 276,000 unserved and underserved locations. After federal deduplication, and we invested about $200 million in ARPA funds earlier this year that will address roughly 40,000 locations across the state. So after federal deduplication and the ARPA investments, that brought us down around 175,000 locations, from 276 down to roughly 175. That was the number as we went into our challenge process. As I mentioned, we had over 90,000 locations challenged. We are still expecting to see that 175. Once the final data is approved and pushed out publicly, we expect to see that number to continue to tick down. So again, we feel that we're in a good position giving our allocation, given some of the cost scenarios that we've run, the analysis we've done. Yeah, we're going to be in a good position for the number of locations left on the table eligible for BEAD.
That's a significant reduction. So what does it take, just before we leave this part for Pennsylvania, what does it take to adjudicate a challenge or a rebuttal? I mean, do you have to go individually through every one of those 90,000?
By and large, you're going into each location that's challenged. Obviously, you can pull from data submitted for locations surrounding that location and apply some of that to your decision-making process. But by and large, it's a tedious process. Our team during the rebuttal and adjudication phase, so we had 3 folks, and then we pulled in a couple other staff just to help. We had a lot of challenges, as you might expect, the last 3 or 4 days. I think so. Our window was 30 days, and about half of our 90,000+ challenges came in the last 3 or 4 days.
That's usually the way it goes.
Yeah.
So for all the states out there who are now becoming data scientists, I applaud you. This is a massive amount of data to crunch through. So Evan, with that context, I know Cartesian recently came out with a model that showed that the locations for BEAD were somewhere now potentially around 5.5 million, which is a significant reduction from where we were a couple years ago. I mean, part of that, of course, is a testament to the massive amount of government funding that has been pushed into the marketplace, not just BEAD, which of course we've yet to see the impact of that. Can you comment on what you're seeing from the states and how that what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the challenge process is working in exactly the way Congress and then NTIA intended it to. The maps are getting more accurate. There has been a tremendous amount of investment by other federal agencies, by states, by the industry, absent government intervention. And when you take an FCC map that starts with what is true today, and then you layer in all of those binding commitments and planned industry developments, you would expect to see a significant swing on the basis of that in the number of eligible locations. And so, that was what we anticipated happening, and that is what's happening. We're also seeing community anchor institutions and units within multi-dwelling, apartments. You can get caught up in kind of like the acronym land, right? MDUs, right? And that is the way we talk about it in practice. But what we mean is apartments and condos in buildings, right? We're seeing them and CAIs get identified. We're working together with the states, and critically, really critically, the states, subject matter expert staff, and expert contractors to make this work. I am not, in fact, a data scientist. You can undergo this exercise where non-experts talk to their experts and then talk to each other and then talk back, and you engage in kind of a telephone. That's really not productive. And so, one of the things that we're really getting good at now is getting into dialogue, letting the experts talk to the experts. And so all of that is working to create this very clear universe of BEAD eligible locations. And upon the conclusion of the challenge processes in all 56 states and territories, what we will know is, okay, these are the locations, the broadband serviceable locations, that are going to be eligible for BEAD infrastructure to serve them. And this is all by design. You can think of BEAD as, in many ways, kind of a cleanup hitter for the Internet for All initiative, right? Like Congress sequenced these things, one hopes intentionally, to happen in this way. And so, you can think about, okay, with BEAD, we've got the healthy tension we talked about before, we got to get these things right. And then you can think about other programs like, for example, NTIA's tribal connectivity program, wherein, you've got an identified specific need and they're going to go a little faster, and then we can tailor BEAD around those other awards to make sure that, we get to the goal, which is Internet for all Americans.
So with the reduction in the number of BSLs that most states seem to be experiencing, do you anticipate that, and so everyone understands, this does not reduce the amount of funding to a state. So the state will have the same amount of funding, but will need to reach fewer locations. Do you anticipate that you would expect to see more fiber deployed?
One of the complexities of this program is that every network build is a custom build. Every community lives in its own environment, lives in the context of all that came before, right? Has network that's adjacent to it of, X, Y, or Z technology, is in a state that has a certain amount of money, is served by providers that are interested in expanding, providers that feel like, they have less of an appetite for expanding. So, you can speak in very broad generalities, right? That like with fewer locations, you would anticipate there being able to be a greater expenditure on a location by location basis. That ought not be controversial. That's the way division works. But it would be very hard to take that general statement and make it specific to a state or a part of a state. So we're still going to have to see how the subgrant processes works, how strong these applications are for given projects by providers. And then, what I do have a tremendous confidence in is the ability of our state broadband offices and our state broadband directors to get the best connection possible for as many of their folks as they can.
So I've heard some of the states talk about they anticipate potentially having money left over after reaching all of the locations, unserved, underserved, and community anchor institutions. Is that realistic, considering the potential rise of costs and the demand for services?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are going to be states that are going to be spending all of their funds on infrastructure, and there are going to be states that are going to be able to complete their infrastructure mission and have funds remaining under their allocations. And we're working with all the states to make sure that all of the dollars that they've been awarded under this program are used to maximum benefit. For states that need to use all of their funds for infrastructure deployment, that's fantastic, and we want to make sure that they get the best infrastructure possible within those funding constraints. It's also worth noting, though, that even those states that are going to be really flat out, right, you're not going to hit it on the nose, and these allocation figures are very large. And so even if a state plans to spend all of its money on infrastructure and it spends 99.5% of its funds in that fashion, if there's not another straightforward project that lands right at that 0.5%, right, that will then still be usable funds for non-deployment activities. And given the difference in cost between infrastructure and non-infrastructure uses, it can still wind up being a really significant amount of money. $500,000 is not a ton of money in an infrastructure context. It is a big grant to a nonprofit that's doing digital literacy work, for example.
So you mentioned MDUs a moment ago, and I know that this is one area that's been a little bit murky for folks because, in the context of BEAD, really an MDU is just a dot on a map, but you don't realize how many homes that potentially represents. Can you comment on NTIA's expectation regarding connecting all of the individual housing units to the minimum speeds of 120 simultaneously?
Yes, so, this is not a ball we feel like we've hidden. Internet for all means internet for all. We mean what we say. People who live in apartments in MDUs are people who live in apartments and MDUs, right? We can diagram these sentences, but we expect states and territories to treat an unserved MDU in the same way they would treat any other location, provided it's been identified properly during the challenge process and it's on the map. The NOFA makes really clear that these units need to get a wired or a wireline connection based on what makes sense for the building. We know that there are buildings that don't let providers in. Look, that's going to work similarly to, we know I apologize for not being able to attribute this correctly. There was, at a different conference, somebody described the two-click location, which is when a person emerges with a shotgun and says, "You're not coming onto my property," right? Like, that can exist also in the MDU context, and what we would hope is that, when there's a refusal by a property owner to let an ISP on, that, states would work to avail themselves of a different connectivity approach. In MDUs, the NOFA makes very clear that wireless connectivity is a viable approach. I think you're aware that there exist some wireless companies that have a lot of solutions that could maybe work for those folks.
Sure, absolutely. So for the states that have gotten their volume 2, Brandon, for example, and their 365-day clock is ticking. For everyone who doesn't realize that once your volume 2 is approved, you have essentially 365 days to complete your BEAD processes and submit a final proposal to NTIA. So how fast should we expect NTIA to process those challenge results and get those approvals going?
So we're moving those as quickly as we can. As you've heard, these are pretty serious data-heavy affairs. It is not overstating it to say that there are literally millions and millions and millions of data points of locations being adjudicated in these states. And this is, for what it's worth, the first time anyone has done an exercise like this. While states ran challenge processes before, they didn't do them statewide. So this is a new exercise for everybody. The early states and their contractors and our data team at NTIA all had a really steep learning curve that we had to climb up and that we had to iron out, right? And what we're seeing is that that process is working a lot better. The states that went first helped us figure out how to be better at this. And the primary thing that I would say is, please make sure that if you are in a state or you're one of the contractors for the states, that there is a very clear line of communication between the data team at NTIA and the data team that's working at the state level. Don't play the game of telephone wherein, you tell your boss to tell my boss how things are going. That just doesn't work as well, right? Let's let the experts talk to each other. Let's get these things worked out. I would also strongly encourage people to avail themselves of the opportunities that we've laid out to submit sample data, to use our validation script. There are other opportunities to use tools that are available out there. I know the University of Chicago has a free tool that appears to be really, really strong, uses our validation script. I really encourage people to get in early and work with us ahead of time so that we can identify issues before they become major issues.
Thank you. So let's move on to the volume 2 set of questions. And Brandon, I'm gonna start with you on this. And there's a lot of noise out there about some of the more, I guess, controversial aspects of BEAD. And for my friends from Mississippi, I know they would say, read the NOFO if you want to know what those are. But
it's all in there.
But how have you guys been working through in Pennsylvania some of these issues? Specifically like the ACP expiration and the low-cost plans and some of those more challenging aspects of BEAD.
Yeah, there have been some challenges, and when we were developing our volume 2, back late winter, spring of this year, we specifically on ACP, we saw that there might be a challenge in getting ACP reauthorized. So our volume 2 contemplated the fact that there may not be an ACP available to folks. That doesn't alleviate the fact that there still is a low-cost plan that's required of subgrantees. Absent ACP, there's obviously no additional subsidy available there, but there still is a low-cost plan that will be required of all subgrantees. So that's contemplated in our volume 2. In terms of low cost, there's been a lot of discussion around that. We developed a methodology using it's formulaic. So it's not a flat figure. It is formulaic based on federal poverty rate. So each year that will adjust based on federal poverty rate. Our figure is $48 a month and change in 2023 dollars. And that's the low-cost option that will be required to be offered for subgrantees working in Pennsylvania for the BEAD program. In terms of some other challenges, obviously the labor requirements are something that we're watching very closely. We're working closely with our folks, our sister agencies over at Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry to ensure compliance and ensure that we are going to have the workforce ready to go whenever these investments start to hit.
Yeah, it's interesting. Are you seeing in your state providers step to the plate and offering just, on their own low-cost plans? I mean, we've seen for years, Comcast Internet Essentials, Xfinity Internet Essentials is one of the, kind of oldest, more notable programs such as this. But we're seeing a lot of providers in the news stepping forward and saying they're offering low-cost plans or they're offering assistance because, the ACP expiration, even though it's been a short-lived program, had a pretty big impact.
We absolutely are. And in fact, about 2 weeks ago, we released a survey to all the providers offering services in Pennsylvania currently, asking them if they're willing to provide us with some details on their plans, their lower cost plans. And that information is starting to come in. We're going to compile that, make it available on our website so that folks are aware of what's out there, even absent an ACP type program.
Yeah, I think the market may take care of some of this, but it'd be nice if Congress could actually do their job and refund the ACP program. So Evan, with all of these approvals kind of coming in batches, and you're looking at that 365-day timeline, are you concerned about that at some point in time there will be 50 states simultaneously building, and what that means in terms of a strain on resources, particularly construction and labor?
I mean, I wouldn't say concerned. We've been aware from the beginning that preparation and planning to meet the workforce and supply chain and capital availability requirements need to be happening in parallel with everything else the industry and the states have been doing. This is a program and an endeavor that requires a huge amount of coordination between, the federal government and state governments and local governments, the public and the private sector, the workforce development sector, the supply chain. All of this is going to have to work in concert to make this kind of big transformative whole of society effort come together. And that's why there's been so much great work on, for example, supply chain improvements. I mean, we've seen announcements all over the country of new domestic suppliers of core components, new guidance around compliance with the Build American, Buy American rules, and it's why workforce was such an early priority for us. We went state by state. We had Lucy Moore, who's since left NTIA, but who was wonderful, and Will Arbuckle has taken on her portfolio very well. We really focused very hard on making sure that states had a clear approach to workforce availability, and that there was a robust plan to ramp that up. And we're seeing, just a ton of efforts across the country that are really inspiring, right? I mean, there's small ISPs in Minnesota that have funded childcare programs at their facilities, which, by the way, creates new jobs and also makes it easier for folks to work. Wisconsin and Louisiana state technical colleges have created things like that look a lot like apprenticeship programs, and in some instances are apprenticeship programs that allow people to get paid even as they're learning. Some of the largest broadband contractor companies have created sophisticated new training centers all over the country where people are getting up on poles, they're figuring out how to splice fiber, they're learning all of these critical tools. And so, how to do horizontal drilling. There's an awful lot of skills that folks need to acquire. And what we're seeing is that the workforce need will run the gamut from folks that the Department of Labor just categorizes as a laborer. This is somebody who, as long as they show up and they work hard, right, they can get the job done. They're pushing a wheelbarrow, they're digging a ditch. All the way up to very, very, very high education, network engineers and cybersecurity professionals. There's going to be a need across all of those, but what we've already seen is the workforce development sector ramping up to meet that need. And so We feel good about where we are in supply chain. We feel good about where we are in workforce. But it's, like every other part of this program, it's going to require continued effort.
So are you anticipating likely delays in construction, particularly on the back half of the states that are, going to be launching the second grouping of?
Yeah, well, so this is construction, guys. I mean, so if you've ever remodeled, whether you're talking about remodeling a bathroom or a kitchen, or you're talking about doing a mammoth multi-million-dollar network expansion involving thousands of miles of fiber, delays happen in construction. These are complicated. Every one of these, as I said before, is a custom build. And so, subgrantees have 4 years to build. We hope that folks are thoughtful about, what's doable and not doable. And we know that construction can happen at different times in different parts of the country. There are building seasons in parts of the country that differ from other parts, and we are confident that especially the larger actors and the big subcontractors are already good at and will continue to be good at deploying their workforces in ways that make sense relative to the construction schedules of all the projects that they've committed to. We're going to be working really, really, really hard to make sure that subgrantees can get under contract on the time that we've laid out through our technical assistance program. And, look, nobody's going to be unreasonable here. The goal is the goal. The goal is getting it done. So anybody who's working hard, anybody who's building their project in good faith is going to continue to be supported by NTIA as we move toward getting those projects built.
All right, well, we will see how this all plays out, but I know, within the industry, obviously, a lot of you are sitting there thinking, well, yeah, I think this is going to be likely that there'll be some delays in some states. But Brandon, are you concerned with that?
Yeah, we are. But it's encouraging to hear Evan say that as long as there's good faith and we are making progress, that we're going to have the backing of NTIA.
Absolutely.
I think that's important.
Yeah. So just for both of you, this came up actually last night in conversation. There is something called a fixed amount bid, or fixed amount award, excuse me. And I know Louisiana, as the first state, has designated all of their awards to be fixed amount. And for those of you who don't know what this is why we're talking about it, because it's a very important designation. Evan, can you explain what this is?
Yeah, so fixed amount subawards are a really important tool to make this easier for everybody. Effectively, what the state does is it says, if you accomplish X goal, the thing that we've contracted for, you will get the amount of money that you bid for, right, that you ultimately contract for. And there are milestones within those that, when they're hit, funds are deployed. And those milestones can be set in contract between the state broadband office and their subgrantees. So these fixed amount subawards work to say that this is totally made up. These numbers could vary from state by state, but just as an example, right, you could do 10% of the award when the subgrantee gets under contract, and then 10% more when they hit their first 20% of passings, or when they have completed major engineering and permitting. Each of these stages can be set up, and then you'd certainly you must have the last payment happen when the project has been completed, such that you can count on it. What makes that a lot easier is you don't have to do the voucher reimbursement model that requires a tremendous amount more documents be passed between the subgrantee and the grant-making entity and back. So it allows for a much smoother, cleaner, easier flow of funds that reduces the administrative burden on both our grantees and then their subgrantees.
So is it the responsibility of the state to determine what is a fixed amount award, or does the subgrantee in their application process need to ask for that?
That'll vary state by state. So this is all flexibility that states have to take on whether they want to offer fixed amount subawards and the nature of the fixed amount subawards that they want to offer. And then the details get hammered out, as they will in a lot of other respects, in the subgrant agreements that will be signed between the states and their subgrantees.
And Brandon, how are you handling this in Pennsylvania?
We have left the door open for the fixed amount awards. Our standard is the more traditional reimbursement process. That's what we're doing with our ARPA funds now. But our Volume 2 did leave the door open. If applicants request a fixed amount award, then that is something that we'll consider. So that's on the table.
And I do want to say, folks should expect to see more NTIA guidance on those subgrant agreements coming soon. Those are going to be really critical. Those are the operative documents, right? Like, those are the contract between the state and the ISP, and literally this is what the taxpayers want to build and this is what they expect in return for those. And we want to make sure that folks engage in that contracting effort early. We've seen in other programmatic contexts, whether it be federal or state programs, we've seen those subgrant agreements or grant agreements get under contract in like a few weeks, and we've seen that contracting exercise stretch out for more than a year. Obviously, the latter is something that we're not looking forward to or want to see. We set a limit of 6 months in our guidance for how long it should take to get all your subgrantees under contract, and I want to be clear, that's the limit, right? Don't shoot for 6 months. Let's get these contracts signed as quickly as we can so that shovels can get in the ground and fiber can get on the poles.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of activity that's going to be happening simultaneously. But just to close the loop on this, I think anyone applying for BEAD should request or look into a fixed amount award and put it into your application, because there's definite advantages for doing that. So let's move on. I know we've got a bunch of questions. I think we could sit here for a couple hours and do this. So, you know, the $42 billion question is who is going to get the award. And if you ask the big carriers, they'll tell you that it's really, this program is designed to push money into the rural providers. The rural providers, some of them you are saying like they're convinced that the states have made agreements with the bigger guys. So Brandon, what is your expectation? And it's probably somewhere in the middle.
It absolutely is somewhere in the middle. We're going into this eyes wide open. It's going to take big and small providers alike to get this done. We have an enormous amount of work to do in Pennsylvania. We've talked about the need to utilize all technologies, have all technologies in the tool bag to get this done, and that also includes different levels of providers. So we certainly are not going in with any predetermined expectations of, you know, where these dollars are going to go, whether it's to, you know, a bigger provider or a smaller rural provider. I can't overstate that enough. It's going to take the entire provider community to get us there in Pennsylvania.
Well, and what are you looking at from a state perspective as the single most important thing? Is it focused on achieving that scoring, looking at the scoring criteria and, you know, on how high an applicant scores? I mean, what are kind of the primary things you're looking for in applications?
Scoring is critical. Obviously, it's a competitive process. Sustainability is a huge concern. We're not going to make investments in networks that aren't sustainable. We're not doing anyone a favor by doing that. You had asked earlier in the dialogue with Evan with the number of eligible locations coming down, and the fact that we still have, you know, the same allocation. The allocations are not being reduced. I thought that was a very good point, because I've had questions about that recently. You know, we're still at $1.2 billion in terms of our allocation. Your question was, do you expect that we'll be able to do more fiber? In areas where fiber makes sense, sure. But in areas where fiber is not sustainable, the O&M, you know, the calculus doesn't work out, fiber is not going to be the answer. So I'll just say again, it's going to take big, small, medium providers and all technologies to get this done.
It takes a village, right?
But one thing that's really important, the people who are going to get these funds are the people who put in the best applications for them. And I know for sure that the people who don't apply won't. You miss every pitch you don't swing at. And so, you know, what we need to see is folks bringing forward strong applications.
So Evan, that kind of brings forward a question, which is that when a state submits their final proposal, they have to include the list of provisional awards, right? So Brandon, for example, you're going to go through all of your subgrantee selection process and then submit a list of all of the awardees to NTIA. How long do you, what effort is NTIA going to rubber stamp this because the states have done so much work, or, you know, how long is this process going to take?
So the final proposal is going to be a lot more streamlined than the initial proposal. And that makes sense when you think about what those two documents are and what they do. The initial proposal is a plan, and so much more of it is malleable, because we're talking about what someone will do in the future. And so there's a lot more to negotiate out about compliance. It also requires a ton more forethought, because you are trying to anticipate what's going to happen in the future and create a rule set that will be able to be fairly applied to all of these different applicants. The final proposal is much more of a historical document. These are the things that happened. I can't send a state curing to say, well, say that you did this in your challenge or your subgrantee process, rather than that, when what is described there is a thing that happened in the real world that is already the past, right? It simply must be what it is. We've also learned a lot. It's going to be a data-heavy exercise. I mean, the final proposal is going to be a significant data endeavor. The intake of it is going to be much less prose and more data, because there's going to need to be a list of every BEAD-eligible BSL and how they're being served, right? Like, it's going to be, this was served by Project 1, this was served by Project 2, this was served by Project 23, this, it turned out, was a hay bale with a tarp on it and doesn't need service, right? Like, you know, we're going to get all of those lined up, and that'll be evaluated by our data team. We have built out a very robust system of collaboration between our team and the states as they go through the challenge process, and even more significantly, as they go through the subgrantee selection process. A newer member of our team, a senior advisor for BEAD, Kyle Rosner, is spearheading our engagement on subgrantee selection, and he's done a really excellent job. And so states should anticipate very, very, very close collaboration with their FPO, their federal program officer, as they go through the subgrantee selection process, precisely because we can't change it later. So we've got to make sure that everything that's done is compliant, that it follows the rules, and that it creates the best outcome for folks, because once we've made the awards have been made.
We look forward to swift approval of that, I know, because those of us who have invested in U.S. manufacturing are looking for orders to come in. So, which brings me to the next point, which is Buy America and supply chain. And, you know, this has been a complex set of rules that have to navigate, negotiate, and I think, you know, all of the guidance and all of the parts have been issued. So there's nothing more to come on this except for perhaps informational materials. But so for those who aren't familiar, last week NTIA issued a compliance guidelines for Buy America, and what it's going to take for manufacturers to self-certify, what it's going to take for subrecipients to prove compliance. And, you know, pay attention to the document, there's a lot there. And so there's really three, you know, there is a significant amount of confusion in the industry still, Evan, around Buy America. And, you know, I get asked questions all the time about what we're doing. There's a misunderstanding of, you know, of what the waiver does and what it doesn't do. And so, you know, what are you doing to help sort of smooth this over, make sure that the communication is simple with the states, because, you know, the states are really looking to NTIA to provide them with that information.
Yeah, I mean, the Build America, Buy America initiative is great. I mean, and I think it's one that's been really carefully implemented to reflect the values that we all share. You know, we talked earlier about the tension between getting it right and doing it fast. This is another area where there are two really good values that are in tension. You know, I think everybody here agrees that when we're spending a tremendous volume of American taxpayer dollars, that would be best spent with American companies. But we also recognize that not every product, not every service is going to be available from a purely domestic supplier at a price point that works or in volumes that work. And so what we've tried to do is lay out a pathway that honors both of those values in a way that's practical and that can work for industry. And so earlier this year, we released a really narrow and targeted Build American, Buy American, BABA. It's not my favorite acronym, but BABA waiver for the BEAD program. The waiver required, and I'm going to read a little more here than I usually do, guys, because I want to get this right. Will Arbuckle. I talk a lot about members of my team, and that's because they're so incredibly strong. The strength of the BEAD team primarily is the strength of the BEAD team. It's remarkable who's come in to help put their shoulder to the wheel, whether it's in industry or in the states or working with us at NTIA. And Will Arbuckle is the person who's really spearheaded this for us at NTIA, and he's truly a remarkable guy, and would be happy to hear from anybody who has questions about it at BABA, B-A-B-A, at ntia.gov. He will come, he will get all, this guy's in the weeds, guys. He will get down to you on this component versus that component, and we'll answer all your questions. But The waiver requires that certain equipment being produced in the U.S. while waiving domestic manufacturing requirements for other equipment. It's going to result in the majority of broadband fiber equipment, including optical fiber, fiber optic cable, key electronics, and enclosures that are necessary to bring high-speed internet service to everyone, be made here in the U.S. Just last week, we announced a framework for entities to self-certify and report compliance with the BABA requirements and to use the BABA waiver with the BEAD program. This is going to make things easier for everybody because you're going to see that stamp of approval on a supplier, and you're going to know that the stuff you get from that supplier is BABA compliant. There's really two big buckets of how that certification works. The first is the self-certification piece. Manufacturers, at the risk of a federal penalty, will choose to certify that certain equipment they produce meets the domestic manufacturing requirements, and the Department of Commerce is going to host a self-certification page that'll list everybody who's done that. So you'll be able to go to that one page and you'll be able to say, okay, this is what DOC says are compliant folks. And then there's going to be a compliance component to it as well. Manufacturers are going to need to provide to the people who buy from them a compliance letter. Hold on to that, guys. That is the letter that demonstrates that the subgrantee purchased their equipment from a certified stamp of approval supplier. And that letter, you'll need to keep in your records so that if somebody comes looking, you can show, yep, here's where I followed the rules, this person's compliant. And we're really working to make that as easy to do as possible.
Yeah, and I think the key to this is the transparency. And for anyone applying for BEAD, strongly encourage you to talk with your manufacturer and get those certification letters and include them as part of your application, which I imagine would make the states a little more at ease in terms of approving grant applications, because the states are on the hook for compliance as well, right? Brandon, what are you recommending for transparency?
Yeah, we're excited to see the guidance that recently came out from NTIA. That certainly helps us. I think it helps everyone. The self-certification piece is going to be important. From a transparency standpoint, I think the writing is on the wall. And the way it's being handled, I think, is and this is kudos to NTIA. I think in the last week and a half, we've been able to answer a lot of questions that we just simply weren't able to, 2 months ago or even a month ago. So thanks to Evan and the team for helping on that front.
And I can assure you that Will Arbuckle is definitely in the weeds on this.
Yeah.
So as someone who's talked with him probably 4 or 5 dozen times. For Nokia is in the process of self-certifying, and this week, and maybe as early as today, we will actually have a list of certified products on our website. So,
Nice.
So let's move on briefly to Doug. How much time do we have left here? 7 minutes, excellent. All right, so for those of you with questions, we'll get to you in a moment or two, but I just want to talk for a brief minute about the sort of the environmental approval process, because this is something that kind of is lost in the I guess the whole timeline at the moment. So once a subgrantee is awarded a BEAD award and it's final, and you guys have signed off on it, what is the environmental process that they have to undertake?
Sure. So this is an opportunity for me to talk about another truly incredible colleague of mine. Jill Springer, who's joined the NTIA team, is such a phenomenally talented person and has built and is continuing to refine a class of the field federal permitting operation. We have scoured best practices from across the federal government. That has resulted in tons and tons and tons of categorical exclusions that folks can avail themselves of. So you're going to have to, if you take federal dollars, you're going to have to make sure that you're compliant with both National Economic Protection Act protections as well as National Historic Protection permitting requirements. But what we're looking for are ways to make that easier, better, faster, smoother. We've held permitting roundtables all over the country. We've rolled out a really strong process of shared permitting responsibility between the state and the federal government, which would allow us to move these permits faster. We're going to be really, really, really closely tracking subgrantee permitting, and there's going to be a portal that states are going to be able to use to support their subgrantees, as well as additional ways for subgrantees to alert folks as to what permits they're seeking and where they're running into hurdles. Our team, the FPOs in every state, on the other side of final approval, which feels a long way away, but is going to be here before you know it, those FPOs, their primary role is going to be supporting subgrantees in surmounting these efforts. So they're gonna need to know what's going on so that they can triage and weigh in where they can be the most helpful, whether that permitting issue is a federal one where we can speak colleague to colleague, whether it's a state one where we can use the levers that we have available to speak to state governments, either in concert with or in support of the state broadband office, or at the local level where we also anticipate that there will be permitting challenges. And so at all of those levels, there are going to be staff dedicated to supporting everybody who's gotten an award from these programs to make sure, now there are going to be thousands, so we can't work all of them simultaneously, but we will be working as hard as we can. There will be full-time staff whose job is to make this process smoother, better, and the single best engagement with federal environmental and historical permitting that any industry has ever had with the federal government.
So you're anticipating this to be more streamlined than perhaps in the BTOP days when it took 9 months or 12 months to get through this process?
Not here to throw stones at my colleagues who worked on other programs. I can tell you we're going to have the best example of it that's ever been done.
Okay, we'll hold you to that. Brandon, what are you thinking in terms of your awardees for preparing them for this environmental historical preservation process?
Yeah, as you would expect, it's an area where we get a lot of questions, a lot of concerns as folks are making that important decision as to whether or not they're going to participate in BEAD. We're developing some webinar content now that we want to push out here in the next several weeks as we get ready for subgrantee selection and opening our round one, working with the state historic preservation folks. In fact, we just had some meetings last week with them talking about next steps and reviewing some items for the web content. I think we're going to be in a good position. There's been a lot of thought that has gone into preparing for this. We've had some time to do so. And with the guidance and support from NTIA, I think the states are going to be in a good position to roll.
And I think it'll be a little bit easier to manage on a project-by-project basis rather than doing it on a statewide basis, right? That could take forever. With I know, was it Mississippi, Sally? You have like 45,000 or something like that historical sites. It's a lot. So one entity to manage that versus chunking it up in smaller bits is a little bit easier. But it's going to put some pressure certainly on the historic preservation offices to do that consultations and get those streamlined. Okay, so I know we've got a couple minutes left, or maybe we get maybe time for one or two questions. Jeff popped up in the audience and can bring a microphone right to you.
Thank you. Excellent presentations. Can you please comment briefly on the strategic decision-making around resiliency when it comes to fireproofing, flood-proofing a network? We saw in Hawaii how the power poles become Roman candles, and so nobody wants to see the money wasted. Love to hear the resiliency thinking.
Yeah, great question. So the NOFO requires that states take a look at what are the risks posed by the environment to this infrastructure. There are parts of the country that have significant fire risk. There are parts of the country that have significant flooding risk. There are parts of the country that experience severe storms. And what we want to make sure is that these investments are made in a durable fashion. So up front, states have created, as a part of their plan, means by which we can ensure that this infrastructure is adequately robust. It is also a permissible use of non-deployment funds to invest in resiliency and redundancy for networks. And in fact, we're seeing, for example, Puerto Rico is really leading the way on this in a big way, in part because they already had a ton of federal money post-Hurricane Maria, and so they're proposing a really innovative conduit system that I think is going to be really good for industry and is going to be really good for making sure that connectivity remains available on that island, and that there will, I don't think I'm making any news, right? There will be more hurricanes in the Caribbean, right? So let's actually try to, let's try to make sure that the stuff that we build can withstand the storms. And we anticipate seeing that across the country. It can always get better, and in each of these instances, we want to rely on industry expertise. There may be times in which it is doable to be in a storm-prone area, and it simply makes more sense as a result of the topography or something to go aerial and just have pre-positioned supplies and be ready to rebuild as soon as the storm moves on. There are other instances in which hardening that network is the right approach. I have absolute faith in the leadership of state broadband directors and their partners in industry to make the right calls about how to make sure that our networks are as resilient as they can be.
I'll say for climate proofing, you know, I live in here in Colorado in a town called Superior that was hit by we call fire hurricane a couple years ago, 130 mile an hour winds, and the fiber optic cable that was underground melted.
Phew.
So
That's a new one.
you know, sometimes you just can't climate proof it. Brandon, any last thoughts on climate?
Yeah, from a resiliency standpoint, we've baked resiliency into our scoring, so that will be a component that we're going to evaluate projects on. As Evan mentioned, flooding, that's a concern in Pennsylvania. We've done some analysis to better understand where we might have some challenges on that front. Where do we have eligible BEAD locations that are in flood-prone areas? That way we're hyper aware of that when we're evaluating proposals in that area. So we're trying to do our due diligence now and plan for some of those resiliency elements.
I know across the states and territories, we've got fire, we've got ice, we've got everything in between. So, well, thank you both for being here this morning and all the tremendous work that you've done to help
Thank you.
connect all Americans.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Can we go, Jeff? Okay.
Thank you, Lori. So now our breakout sessions start. Please visit with our exhibitors as well, and we'll see you back in here for lunch because you'll get an opportunity to hear from FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr, and we have another amazing keynote planned for you during lunch. So thank you very much for being here, and enjoy the rest of the day. We'll see you here at lunch.